If you ever find yourself on Willow Lane, just outside Cincinnati, Ohio, you'd probably drive right past my house without a second thought. It's the kind of place that blends in with the quiet, tree-lined street, a white colonial with blue shutters, flower boxes under the windows, and a porch swing that creaks in the late afternoon breeze. For 17 years, that house has been my anchor, my shelter, and sometimes my prison. To my neighbors, I'm Sarah Whitman, the friendly housewife with a knack for gardenias, the mother of two polite, ambitious kids, and the woman who never forgets to bring brownies to the 4th of July block party. That's the version of me the world knows. Most days, it's the version I offer up gladly. I wave at people taking their evening walks, ask after their grandkids, and listen to their complaints about property taxes and potholes. In return, I get knowing smiles and invitations to book clubs. It's a comfortable, predictable rhythm. But what nobody suspects, not the neighbors, not even the friends I meet for coffee every Tuesday at Ruth's Diner, is that behind the perfectly trimmed hedges and white picket fence, I am not just a homemaker. I'm not just Mark's wife or Emily and Jacob's mom. I'm the founder and CEO of Meridian Medical, a company I built from nothing in a house that everyone thinks is just a cozy piece of suburbia. I still remember the day the first idea for Meridian Medical came to me. I was sitting in that very kitchen, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows while I tried to keep Emily, then 7, from spilling apple juice on her spelling workbook. My mother, Elaine, had come over to help. She was always helping, always believing in me when no one else did. Mom was a retired nurse from Vermont, the sort of woman who always wore practical shoes and somehow managed to look elegant doing it. She'd spent her whole career frustrated by outdated medical tools and clunky equipment that made doctors' jobs harder, not easier. As we talked, she mentioned how many hospitals in the Midwest struggled to get reliable, affordable surgical instruments. Supplies were always running short, she said, and the big companies only cared about their contracts in the big cities. Something clicked in me that day. I scribbled down a few notes on a napkin, and by the time Mark came home from work, the seed of an idea had already taken root in my mind. Those early days were frantic and filled with doubt. Mark was still working as a project manager at a local tech company, spending long hours at the office and coming home only to collapse in front of the television. I would wait until the house was quiet, then sneak down the hall to my tiny office wedged between the laundry room and the garage. I called it the command center, though to anyone else it was just a desk, an old desktop computer, and stacks of papers and catalogs. I spent late nights researching medical suppliers, cold calling hospitals, and learning everything I could about logistics and regulations. My first investment was a $7,500 check from Mom, which felt like a fortune at the time. She handed it to me one evening over tea, her hands shaking only slightly. "You've got this, Sarah," she said, squeezing my fingers. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Most people would have been skeptical, but not my mother. She understood the hunger that comes from wanting more, from believing that a good idea can be enough to change your life. With her support, I launched Meridian Medical out of my basement, making sales calls in between baking cookies for the PTA and shuttling the kids to piano lessons. Those early deals were small, just a handful of surgical kits delivered to rural hospitals in Ohio and Indiana. But I kept at it, one customer at a time, building relationships, earning trust. I wore every hat: salesperson, accountant, delivery driver, and at the end of each exhausting day, mother and wife. As Meridian grew, so did the strain on my marriage. Mark had always been ambitious when we first met, charming, funny, and full of plans for the future. I loved the way he'd make me laugh, how he'd tell stories at parties that left everyone in stitches. But after the kids were born, something shifted. The pressure of providing for a family weighed on him, and his job became more demanding and less satisfying. He started playing golf on weekends, then during the week, then every chance he got. He'd come home sunburned and tired, tossing his clubs in the corner without a word. I tried to fill in the gaps, both financially and emotionally. When Mark lost his job at the tech firm, laid off with little warning and less ceremony, I was the one who picked up the pieces. He was too proud to accept money from me directly, so I quietly arranged for him to join Meridian Medical's IT department. I told him a friend at the company needed someone trustworthy. He never questioned the story, maybe because it was easier to pretend he'd earned the job on his own. I let him believe it. In my mind, I thought I was protecting him, protecting our marriage. But in reality, I was protecting myself from his disappointment, from my own guilt, from the fear that we might not be able to recover what we'd lost. I paid the mortgage every month, covered the kids' tuition when Emily chose Boston University, and Jacob wanted to study in New York. I took care of the bills, the groceries, the vacations to Florida that Mark insisted would bring us closer together. I even paid off his credit card debts, quietly transferring the balances to my own account. never mentioning the late fees or the missed payments. The more I gave, the less he seemed to notice. The more I held things together, the less he appreciated the amount of work it took to make everything look effortless. My mother remained my biggest supporter. She visited every few weeks, staying for the weekend and offering to help with whatever needed doing, cooking, cleaning, even helping me stuff catalogs into envelopes from Meridian's quarterly mailers. Mark barely acknowledged her. He'd grumble about her taking up space, complain that she meddled in our business. Once, when she slipped us a check to help with Emily's freshman dorm fees, Mark just shoved it in a drawer and never said thank you. I felt embarrassed for him, but I was more embarrassed for myself. I was starting to see how much I had let things slide, how much I had allowed him to pull away from me and from the family we had built. Things came to a head the winter after Mom took a bad fall on the icy front steps. I dropped everything, canceled meetings, postponed shipments, left a stack of emails unread to rush her to the hospital. Mark barely looked up from his laptop. She should be more careful, he muttered, and then he went back to scrolling through sports highlights. It was in that moment, sitting in there with Mom, watching her try to hide her pain behind a brave smile, that I realized just how alone I had become. My life was full of people, full of obligations and achievements, but somehow I'd become invisible to the one person who was supposed to be my partner. I told myself it was just a phase. People change. Marriages go through ups and downs. Maybe Mark would snap out of it. Perhaps he'd remember who we used to be. But deep down, I knew better. The truth was, it was easier to keep secrets, easier to let him believe what he wanted, easier to pretend that everything was fine. Sometimes, it was just easier to be alone. That's how I lived, day after day, year after year, a successful businesswoman in secret. A housewife in public, a daughter who still needed her mother's reassurance. And a wife waiting for her husband to notice that she was still there. If you ever find yourself on Willow Lane and you happen to pass by that white colonial with the blue shutters, you'd never guess what stories its walls could tell. You'd never guess who I am. Looking back now, it's easy to spot the warning signs. The dull ache that started at the base of my skull. The way my vision sometimes blurred around the edges. When I tried to read contracts late into the night. The exhaustion that clung to me even after a full night's sleep. But at the time, I chalked it all up to stress. Running Meridian Medical had become a full-time job and then some. Especially as the company picked up more contracts in both America and Europe. Juggling my work, the house, and what little was left of my marriage had left me stretched thin. Like so many women I knew, I convinced myself that I could push through the headaches and the fatigue. That I had to. The turning point came on a gray, rain-soaked Monday in March. I was standing in the kitchen staring out the window at the steady drizzle while waiting for the kettle to boil. Mark had left earlier that morning for his weekly networking golf meeting, a term I'd long since learned to translate as a few hours spent at the club, swapping stories with the same three men and drinking overpriced beer. Mom had stayed the weekend, but she was already on her way back to Vermont, promising to call as soon as she got home. I was alone, surrounded by the quiet hum of the house, thinking about the week ahead, a new product launch, several invoices to approve, and a never-ending stream of emails waiting for me. Suddenly, a sharp pain split through my head. It was as if someone had driven a spike behind my eyes. The world tilted. The mug I was holding slipped from my hand, shattering on the tile floor. I tried to steady myself on the counter, but the pain intensified and my knees buckled. The last thing I remember is the dull thud of my body hitting the floor, the smell of coffee mixing with the metallic tang of fear. When I woke up, harsh fluorescent lights glared above me. The sterile scent of disinfectant and antiseptic stung my nose. I was in the emergency room, and for snaking out of my left arm, a monitor beeping steadily at my side. Mom was there, her face drawn tight with worry. One hand clutching my own while the other fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. Mark stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, looking impatient. The hours that followed were a blur, doctors coming and going, nurses asking me to rate my pain, CT scans and blood work, all performed with a detached efficiency that made me feel more like a case number than a person. Finally, a neurologist sat at my bedside, her expression gentle but grave. The scans had revealed a tumor pressing against my brain, benign but dangerously aggressive. Surgery was not just recommended, it was necessary, and soon, there was no time to process. No time to be scared. Everything shifted into a series of decisions and signatures, consent forms, pre-op instructions, a blur of medical jargon and clipped voices. Mark listened in silence, occasionally glancing at his phone. When the doctor left, he cleared his throat and said, "Well, that's just great. Couldn't this have waited until after the summer?" I stared at him, unable to process the words at first. Was this a joke? The flicker of hope I'd always kept alive for us dimmed a little more in that moment. Mom, in contrast, was steady as ever. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "We'll get through this, sweetheart." "I'm not going anywhere," I believed her. I always had. The days leading up to the surgery were some of the longest of my life. I was admitted to Good Samaritan Hospital and my world shrank to a small, windowless room on the neurology floor. The walls were a tired beige, the air tinged with the constant beeping of machines and the low murmur of nurses in the hallway. Every morning, a parade of doctors made their rounds, updating me on test results and checking my vitals. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling tiles, imagining the life I might lose, the business I might never return to, and the children who still needed their mother. Mark visited sporadically, usually after his golf games, always complaining about the parking or the cafeteria food. He'd sit by the window, scrolling through his phone, barely making eye contact. "Let me know when they're going to do something," he grumbled one afternoon, as if my recovery was just another appointment he had to squeeze in. The indifference hurt more than the pain in my head. I wanted him to care, to reach for my hand, to ask if I was scared. But he didn't. It was Mom who filled the void. She sat at my bedside for hours, her hands busy with her knitting needles, the steady click-clack of yarn comforting in its normalcy. She told me stories about her days as a nurse in Vermont, about patients who had beaten the odds, about the ways women found strength even in the darkest moments. She brought me herbal tea, smuggled in my favorite magazines, and made sure the nurses checked my IVs on time. Sometimes, in the quiet of the early morning, she'd just hold my hand and let me cry. The surgery itself was a blur of anesthesia and bright lights. I remember the cold sting of the four, the soft voices of the surgical team, and then nothing. When I woke, hours later, my head was wrapped in bandages, my throat dry and scratchy from the breathing tube. The doctor told me the surgery had gone as well as possible, but recovery would be slow. There would be weeks, maybe months of physical therapy, follow-up scans, and constant vigilance. The days that followed were some of the loneliest of my life. Mom was there every morning, holding my hand, bringing me news from home. The kids called from Boston and New York, their voices tight with worry, promising to come home as soon as they could get away from school. But Mark remained absent. When he did show up, he looked restless, like he couldn't wait to leave. He never once asked how I was feeling. He never brushed the hair from my face or kissed my forehead. He sat in the corner, scrolling through his phone, occasionally sighing as if he were the one in pain. It's strange, the things you notice when your life falls apart. The way a hospital room sounds in the middle of the night, the scent of hand sanitizer lingering on your skin, the way you start to recognize the nurses by their shoes or the cadence of their voices. But what I noticed most was the aching silence between Mark and me, the gulf that had grown so wide. I wondered if it could ever be crossed. On the third night after surgery, as I lay propped up by pillows, trying to distract myself with a crossword puzzle, Mark walked in. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He didn't ask if I needed anything. Instead, he tossed a thick manila envelope onto my tray table, with a thud that echoed off the linoleum floor. My first thought was that he'd brought something from the office, a get well card, maybe, or papers that needed my signature. I reached for the envelope, but before I could open it, he spoke. "I want a divorce," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I'm taking the house, and I want half of everything, your little business included." I stared at him, unable to process what I was hearing. The pain in my head was nothing compared to the ache that settled in my chest. For a moment, I thought I must be hallucinating, that the medication was making me imagine things. But the look in his eyes was all too real. He didn't wait for me to respond. He turned on his heel and left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. I sat there, the envelope heavy in my hands, the quiet hum of the hospital suddenly deafening. Tears prickled at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I took a shaky breath and glanced at Mom, who had watched the whole exchange in stunned silence. She reached over, squeezed my hand, and whispered, "You are stronger than you know, Sarah." In that moment, something inside me shifted. The woman Mark thought he could break no longer existed. I was still scared, still hurting, but I was done being invisible. I was done waiting for someone else to rescue me. The storm had come, but I was still standing. And for the first time in a long time, I knew I would survive on my terms. I didn't say a word as Mark left my hospital room, the manila envelope still heavy in my hands. The edges pressed sharply into my palms, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing, trying to fit his words, his coldness, into the reality I'd once believed we shared. I had always known things were bad, but I never imagined he would be so calculating, so heartless, as to serve me divorce papers while I was still recovering from brain surgery. As the minutes ticked by, anger started to bubble up beneath the ache and fatigue. It was an old, familiar heat, but this time it wasn't going to be tamped down by shame or compromise. When the nurse finally came to check my vitals, I asked for a pen. My hand trembled as I slid open the envelope and pulled out the thick stack of papers his demands spelled out in cold, legal jargon. He wanted the house. He wanted half of my little business. He wanted spousal support. The list went on. I found myself laughing, a bitter, disbelieving sound that echoed in the sterile quiet of the room. If only he knew the truth. What Mark had never understood, what he had never cared to learn, was that Meridian Medical wasn't just a side project or a cute distraction. It was my life's work, my creation, something I had grown from the ground up. He didn't know that the friend who'd given him a job at Meridian was me. That every time he cashed a paycheck, he was drawing from the very business he'd just tried to seize. He didn't know that the board of directors, the CEO, the majority shareholder, they were all me. All those years of late nights, secret meetings, and carefully balanced ledgers had kept my secret safe. And now, in his arrogance, he'd finally given me the chance to claim it for myself. The next morning, after my final round of post-op scans, I called my attorney, Linda. She'd been with me since the early days, a sharp-eyed woman from Cleveland who'd guided me through every contract and acquisition with unflinching loyalty. Mark served me divorce papers, I told her, my voice steadier than I felt. He's trying to take the company. Linda didn't hesitate. We'll take care of it, she said. And Sarah, don't sign anything. Not one page, I promised I wouldn't. That afternoon, Mom arrived at the hospital with a homemade casserole and a thick file folder. She held my hand while we went over the papers, her presence steadying me, reminding me that no matter how dark things got, I was never truly alone. When I was finally discharged, 2 weeks later, I returned to a house that felt foreign. Mark was gone most of the day, supposedly working at the Meridian office, but in reality, he was at the country club or his new apartment downtown. The few times our paths crossed, he was distant, smug, already behaving as if the house and my life were his by default. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, gathering documents, scanning emails, and piecing together the evidence I needed. I kept a quiet confidence, knowing the wheels I'd set in motion would soon change everything. 2 days after my return, Mark received a formal notice at the office. His employment with Meridian Medical had been terminated, effective immediately. It was signed by me. I'd waited until my signature had regained its steadiness, until I could print my name without a tremor of regret. There was a strange sense of liberation in seeing it on official letterhead. The power that I had hidden for so long now finally in the open. For the first time in years, I felt like the architect of my own life. The fallout was immediate. Mark stormed home that afternoon, his face red with fury. He slammed the front door, yelling about betrayal and injustice. "You can't do this to me," he shouted. "I built that company with you. I deserve my share." I listened in silence, letting him get it all out. When he was done, I spoke quietly. "You never built anything, Mark. You never even asked what I was doing. You don't own a single share." He stared at me, searching for any sign that I was bluffing, but I held his gaze. He stormed out again, slamming the door behind him. I knew then that this wasn't just about money. For Mark, it was about pride, about control. But for me, it was about freedom. I called a meeting with my legal team the very next morning. Linda came prepared, having already found more holes in Mark's paperwork than a fishing net. His demands were riddled with errors, unsupported claims, and outright lies. It turned out that Mark had been hiding more than his resentment. He had been siphoning money from our joint accounts for months, funneling it into a private fund he kept hidden in another bank. And as Linda's investigator dug deeper, another truth surfaced. Mark had been having an affair with a woman he'd met at the country club. A fact confirmed by credit card receipts, hotel bills, and a series of incriminating text messages. The betrayal stung, but it also clarified my path. I gathered all the evidence, printed every bank statement and email, every text and call log. My lawyers prepared a counterclaim, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, I felt the power shift back into my hands. The process wasn't quick, and it wasn't painless. Mark's attorney tried to play hardball, calling to negotiate, but I was calm and clear. "The company is mine," I said. "All financial support stops immediately. I'll see you in court." Linda was a force of nature. She made sure every asset was protected, every account locked down. Meridian Medical's books were ironclad, and there was no way for Mark to prove he had any ownership or stake. The board backed me completely. Many of them had known all along who was running the show. As the truth came to light, Mark's story unraveled. His affair became public knowledge at the country club, where whispers turned into open contempt. His friends, once eager to share a drink or a round of golf, began to distance themselves. He found himself isolated, his reputation in tatters. At home, things were quieter. Mom stayed with me for weeks, helping me regain my strength. She made me soup and read aloud the emails I couldn't yet focus on. She was the only one who hugged me after long days at the lawyer's office, whispering, "You always were the strong one, honey." I believed her more now than I ever had before. Mark tried to fight back, of course. He filed motions and threatened lawsuits. He sent angry emails and left desperate voicemails. But with each passing day, his grip on my life loosened. My lawyers handled the paperwork, and I refused to engage in the drama. I answered only what was required, always through official channels, never letting him draw me back into old arguments or tired accusations. The kids came home for a weekend to see me worried, confused, but supportive. I told them only what they needed to know, that their father and I were separating, that I would always love them and be there for them, and that I was going to be just fine. They hugged me tight, their belief in me giving me fresh resolve. I watched them walk out the door, tall and strong, and realized that, in my way, I had given them everything I'd ever hoped to have for myself: independence, courage, and the knowledge that they could weather any storm. As the divorce proceedings dragged on, I found unexpected moments of peace. I sat on the porch in the evenings, wrapped in a blanket, watching the Ohio sky turn shades of lavender and gold. I found myself breathing deeper, laughing more with Mom, and feeling the weight of Mark's presence finally start to lift. I remembered the woman I'd been before the compromises, before the secrecy and shame, a woman who could make hard decisions, who could build something out of nothing, who could survive even the worst storms. In the end, Mark got what he deserved, nothing more, nothing less. The company was safe, the house would soon be sold, and my accounts were protected. As for him, he was left to face the consequences of his own choices. I felt no triumph in his downfall, only relief. For the first time in years, I felt like I could look ahead instead of back. The truth had come out. The consequences had been faced. And as I stood at the edge of my old life, I realized that what waited on the other side was not just freedom, but the promise of something new, a future that, for the first time, truly belonged to me. The day Mark moved his last box out of the house on Willow Lane, the air felt strangely light, almost as if the walls themselves were sighing with relief. I watched from the living room window as he loaded his golf clubs and a few battered suitcases into the trunk of his car. There was no drama left between us, no final shouting match, no desperate plea for understanding. Only a hollow silence as he pulled away, leaving a trail of dust in the late afternoon sun. I stood there for a long moment, my hand resting on the cool window pane, feeling equal parts exhausted and liberated. The past months have tested me more than any other time in my life. The tumor, the surgery, the legal battles, the betrayal, all of it seemed to settle in my bones like a deep ache. But beneath it all, something new was rising, quiet and determined, a sense of peace, of possibility that I hadn't felt in years. Mom came up behind me, wrapping her arms around my shoulders. "You did it, Sarah," she whispered. There were tears in her eyes, but her voice was full of pride. "You're free." Free. The word echoed in my mind, both exhilarating and terrifying. For so long, I'd measured my worth by the stability of my marriage, the success of my business, and the approval of others. Now, with Mark finally gone and the divorce papers signed, I realized how much of myself I'd sacrificed in the name of keeping the peace. I thought of all the quiet compromises, the late nights spent hiding work from my husband, the years I'd let my dreams shrink to fit someone else's expectations. I thought about the Sarah who used to paint watercolors in the sunroom, who loved spontaneous road trips, who once dreamed of hiking in the Rockies. That night, after Mom went to bed, I wandered through the empty house, room by room, letting myself remember. The living room was where Emily and Jacob had built blanket forts on rainy days. The kitchen where I'd stayed up late with Mom, plotting the next big move for Meridian Medical over mugs of tea. My tiny, cluttered home office, the command center where I'd built a company from scratch while the rest of the world believed I was just a housewife. I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch, breathing in the scent of grass and honeysuckle. The Ohio River glimmered in the distance, the city lights just visible beyond the trees. I wrapped myself in a blanket and listened to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope. The weeks that followed were a time of letting go and starting over. I met with a realtor and together we staged the house for sale. I boxed up old photos and knickknacks, sorting what to keep and what to donate. Each item was a memory, a piece of my old life, but I realized that I was no longer bound to any of it. I kept what mattered: my children's drawings, Mom's quilt, a few favorite books, and let the rest go. Within a month, the house sold for $800,000. The new owners were a young couple, full of excitement and dreams. I watched as they painted the nursery, their laughter echoing down the halls. I wished them well and felt no sadness as I handed over the keys. I'd outgrown the house, just as I'd outgrown the woman I used to be. I bought a sunny loft in downtown Cincinnati right by the river. It was open and modern, with tall windows and exposed brick, the kind of space I'd always admired but never dared to imagine for myself. Mom moved in for a few months, helping me settle in, filling the kitchen with the comforting smells of her baking. She brought her old rocking chair and her stories, and in the quiet evenings, we'd sit on the balcony, sipping tea and watching the city lights flicker to life. Physically, recovery was slow but steady. I attended every therapy appointment, did my exercises, and listened to my doctors. There were days when fatigue pulled at me and fear of the tumor's return crept in at the edges. But I faced those days head on, determined not to let fear define me. Mom was my constant cheerleader, celebrating each small victory, a walk around the block, a morning without a headache, the first time I managed to climb the stairs without stopping for breath. At work, I took back the reins of Meridian Medical with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. My team, now fully aware of my role, rallied around me. I delegated more, trusted others, and began to focus on strategy and growth rather than the daily grind. We secured new contracts with hospitals in Chicago, Philadelphia, and even London. For the first time, I traveled to Europe for business, meeting partners face to face. Shaking hands as the CEO I truly was, I no longer needed to hide behind anyone's name or approval. It was on one of those trips, a rainy afternoon in London, that I found myself wandering through the Tate Modern. Stopping in front of a canvas streaked with color and light, I stood there, mesmerized, tears prickling at my eyes, not from sadness, but from gratitude. I was alive, I had survived, and I had done it on my terms. Back home, I started painting again. I set up a small studio in the corner of my loft, hanging blank canvases on the walls, letting the light pour in through the windows. My first painting was of the Ohio River at dawn, soft pinks and blues, the city skyline shimmering in the distance. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and it marked the start of something new. I reached out to old friends I'd lost touch with during the hardest years. We met for coffee, caught up on each other's lives, and laughed until our sides ached. I hosted dinner parties in my new home, inviting neighbors, colleagues, and the women I'd met at conferences, women with stories like mine, women who knew the strength it took to start over. We shared our triumphs and our heartbreaks, building a new community together. As the months passed, news of Mark's decline filtered back to me. He lost his job, his reputation in ruins after word of his affair and financial recklessness got around. The woman he'd been seeing left him soon after. He tried, I heard, to start over in Chicago, but nothing seemed to stick. I felt no anger toward him, only a distant sadness for the man he could have been, and a profound relief that his chaos was no longer part of my life. I continued to heal, not just physically but emotionally. Therapy helped. Painting helped. Time helped most of all. I traveled more, visited Emily in Boston and Jacob in New York. I hiked in the Rockies, finally crossing that dream off my list. I filled my life with things that nourished me: music, art, long walks along the river, Sunday mornings with Mom at the farmer's market. One evening, as I watched the sunset from my balcony, I realized that the approval I had always sought from Mark, from society, even from myself, had lost its power over me. True happiness, I discovered, wasn't about keeping the peace or meeting someone else's standards. It was about honoring myself, listening to my needs, and trusting that I was enough. Now, when I wake in the morning, I greet the day with a sense of gratitude and possibility. The woman I see in the mirror is older, wiser, and stronger than I ever imagined. She has survived storms and heartache, built a business and a life on her terms, and learned the hardest lesson of all: happiness isn't something you earn from others. It's something you give to yourself, one brave choice at a time. And so I move forward, step by step, into this new light, choosing peace, self-respect, and the unshakable knowledge that I am exactly where I belong.